Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Maylene Casil, and I will be discussing on the common infectious diseases here in our setting. So for the objectives, first is to recognize common presentation of infectious diseases and be familiar with the usual infectious causes of these conditions based on epidemiology, manifestations, differential diagnosis. Next is to choose the appropriate workup to establish diagnosis based on the clinical presentation. Next is to establish diagnosis focusing on the more common infectious disease here in our setting in the Philippines, and to discuss the rationale behind the treatment and draw a basic plan. To recognize complications and determine when to admit or refer to a specialist, and to institute appropriate prevention and control measures. So I will allow you to take pictures of my slide, but I will not give out slides. So please take note. First, let's discuss on fever, because this is one of the most common manifestations that you will encounter in the hospital or in the clinical setting. So the normal temperature range that is between a rectal temperature of 36.6 to 37.9 degrees Celsius. So the highest point would be early in the evening, and the lowest point would be that in the morning. So fever, on the other hand, is a normal response to a variety of conditions. Usually it is from an infection. So it is considered as fever when there is a rectal temperature that reaches at least 38 degrees Celsius and above, an axillary temperature of at least 37.4 and above, an oral temperature of at least 37.6 degrees Celsius and above, a tympanic or in the ear temperature of 37.6 and above. When you say hyperpyrexia, this pertains to a fever that reaches at least 40 degrees Celsius and above. So the pattern of fever can also help you provide clues to the underlying etiology. Take, for example, in viral infections, it is typically associated with slow decline of fever over the several days. So whereas in your bacterial infections, it is often associated with prompt resolution of fever after an effective antimicrobial treatment. So here in the slide, so first, you have your intermittent fever. When you say intermittent fever, there is an increase of temperature observed over 24 hours. Then this varies with intervals on normal temperature. So take for example, the mother will tell you that, "Doc, my child has fever." "Mommy, what is the highest temperature of your child?" So let's just say it's 39 degrees Celsius. So, "Mommy, does it go away or does the temperature go back to the normal range?" The mother will tell you, "Yes, Doc, after a few hours, no, but it should be within 24 hours, the temperature will go back to a normal level, so like 36.9, 37. So that is what you meant by intermittent pattern of fever. Next is remittent fever. When you say remittent fever, there is an increase in temperature observed over 24 hours. It varies by more than 0.5 degrees Celsius in a day, but it does not return to normal levels of the temperature. So for example, the mother will tell you that the highest temperature is 39 degrees Celsius. Doc, it decreases, but only up to 38. So it decreases, but the decrease does not reach the normal level. Still, it is within the febrile range. Next is sustained and continuous fever. So there is a persistently increase of the temperature but does not vary by 0.5 degrees Celsius over a 24-hour period. So you differentiate it from your remittent, no, in-year sustained and continuous fever. So again, the mother will tell you, Doc, the highest temperature is 38. It will only decrease up to 38.6. It will go back to 40 degrees. It will go back to 39 degrees eventually. So it will just decrease a little. It will not decrease more than 5 degrees Celsius. Next is your septic or your hectic fever. So there is an extreme wide fluctuation in the temperature. Next is relapsing fever. So with the relapsing fever, you differentiate it as compared to your intermittent. Here in your relapsing fever, so the febrile episodes are separated by intervals of normal temperature. This time, it's days, weeks, or years. As compared to your intermittent fever will go back to the febrile range within a 24-hour period. For this, it's over days, weeks, and years. Next is your biphasic fever. It's a single illness with two distinct periods. So it's otherwise known as a camelback fever pattern. So I think everyone knows what a camel is. No? So here, so there was an increase in temperature, and then it will decrease. You thought that the patient is already a febrile. However, there would be one more increase in the temperature before it permanently becomes a febrile. One good example of this is your dengue fever, before they go into the defervescent stage. For a short review on the pathophysiology of fever, I took this from Nelson. So there are 3 different mechanisms that can produce fever. First is your endogenous or your exogenous pyrogen. That's here. Next is heat production exceeding your exogenous, second is heat production exceeding the heat loss. And third is the defective heat loss. So in your endogenous pyrogens, go way back here. So example of which are your cytokines, your interleukins, your tumor necrosis factor, and your interferon beta and your gamma, stimulated leukocytes and other cells. So these can be caused by inflammatory disease or malignancy. Infectious disease and drugs can also contribute to endogenous pyrogen. So here, your infectious disease drugs, they are actually exogenous pyrogens, which are also capable of being endogenous pyrogens. So they can also contribute. So microbes, microbial toxin, and other products of microbes are common exogenous pyrogens. So they produce. So the exotoxin itself can directly affect the thermoregulation in the hypothalamus and stimulate endogenous pyrogen release. So your drugs as well, such as your vancomycin, amphotericin B, and allopurinol, are also known to cause fever. So the second mechanism of heat production would be heat production exceeding the heat loss. And this can be brought about by salicylic poisoning due to an increase in tissue glycolysis and in malignant hyperthermia due to a syndrome of hypermetabolism involving the skeletal muscle. Third mechanism, that is the defective heat loss. So one good example is ectodermal dysplasia, in which it is a disorder that affects the skin, sweat glands, hair, teeth, and nails. So for the second and the third mechanism, it contributes to the change in blood temperature as well as stimulate the cold and the warm receptors in the skin and the muscles. So these 3 mechanisms, your endogenous and exogenous pyrogen, number 2, your heat production exceeding heat loss, your defective heat loss, would all contribute. Their goal is to stimulate your thermosensitive neuron in the preoptic and the anterior hypothalamus. Thereby, there would be a redirection of your blood to and from the cutaneous vascular beds. There would be an increase or a decrease in sweating, and there would be a regulation in your extracellular volume, fluid volume, by your arginine vasopressin. This is a known vasodilator. And of course, it will lead the patient to having behavioral responses such as seeking a warmer or a cooler environment. Thereby, there would be a new hypothalamic center. So fever per se is not a disease. No, it's just considered rather as a symptom of an underlying condition. So most cases are actually acute. There are self-limited viral infections such as common colds, influenza, gastroenteritis, and uncomplicated bacterial infections such as your otitis media, pharyngitis, and sinusitis. So most common causes of fever in children are actually benign, but it is important to rule out life-threatening conditions. Now let us go back to the history. So we have to go back to the history to ask further to help us differentiate, to help us with our differential diagnosis. So in the history, we ask for, of course, the fever. We have to ask for the onset, the duration, the characteristic, the highest temperature. We also need to ask the associated signs and symptoms, such as your drowsiness, skin rash, ear pain, loss of smell and taste, stiff neck or neck pain, abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, pain on passing urine or your dysuria, convulsions or seizures. And in the past medical history, it is important to ask regarding allergies to food and drugs. Any drugs that the patient has taken, any recent contact with a person of with an infectious disease, any recent travel, and we should ask about the vaccination history of our patient. On physical exam, we check for the sensorium as to is the patient lethargic or drowsy? Is there any presence of pallor, cyanosis, or jaundice? For the skin, we have to ask for any, we have to see or we have to examine if there are any skin rash, and we have to describe it, whether it's macule, or papule, or maculopapular, is there purpura, petechiae, or pustules. And also have to note for any signs of infection, the common that you may hear, no, rubor, calor, dolor. So we have to ask redness, no, that's redness, warmth, swelling, and tenderness. For the head, eyes, ears, nose, and throat, we have to ask. We have to check for any for the fontanelle. If your patient is still an infant, you have to check for the fontanelle, whether it's flat, bulging, or depressed. We have to check any discharges from all the openings, such as the ears, the nose, the eyes, the mouth. Then we also have to do an otoscopic exam to check for the eardrum, and also to check for the mastoid area if there is presence of any swelling and tenderness. For the oropharynx, you have to check for any lesions for possible enanthem. No? You have to check for like Kuplik spots, you have to check for mouth ulcers, tongue appearance also, you have to include that as well. And for the tonsils, you have to check if whether they are swollen or they have the presence of any exudates. For the neck, you have to check for any stiffness, and you have to palpate for any lymphadenopathy. Then for the chest and lungs, you have to note for any increase in the work of breathing, such as your tachypnea and your retractions. For the cardiovascular system, we have to take note of any murmurs. For the abdomen, any hepatosplenomegaly or palpable masses or any tenderness. And for the limbs, you have to note for any difficulty in movement of the joints and limbs, any warmth, swelling, redness, and tenderness in the joints. So to help us narrow down the differential diagnosis, so we must consider the duration and the recurrence of the fever, any travel history, any presence of any localizing sign, or any rash. So in this slide, we can see the presence of fever. You can classify it. So fever of 7 days or lesser, and if it is associated with any localizing sign or no localizing sign. Next is fever with an accompanying rash. fever of more than 7 days? And is it a recurrent fever? Or is it a fever from a child, no? In a child coming back from a travel who went to an epidemic or endemic area where a certain epidemic or a pandemic of a certain infectious disease? Before we go to the differential diagnosis, I will discuss first on the basic management of fever. So since fever is only a manifestation and not a disease, so the management is only supportive. So for pharmacologic management, we may give either your paracetamol or your ibuprofen. So these two main drugs in children to lower temperature and are comparably safe and effective. But you have to take note that we do not give this left and right. We restrict it to those children who have fever and are uncomfortable and are distressed due to the fever. And we should use the lowest effective dose for the shortest period of time. So children who are actually just alert, running around, active, eating well, even if they are febrile, they are actually unlikely to benefit from your antipyretic treatment. So here are our recommended doses. So for paracetamol, so you have 10 to 15 milligram per kilogram per dose. You can give that every 4 to 6 hours. And your ibuprofen is 5 to 10 milligram per kilogram per dose. That's every 6 to 8 hours. And please take note of the maximum doses you can give in a day. So as pediatrician, one of our duty is to provide counseling to the caregivers on the management of fever at home. So here is a guide. I took this from the pocketbook of your primary health care for children and adolescents. So here is a guide on how we can counsel the caregiver regarding fever. So you have to explain to the parents or to the caregiver that fever is actually not a disease, because most parents, when the patient has fever, they become worried, so worried, and they would really ask you for any antibiotic. So you really have to explain that fever is actually a mechanism, it's not a disease. It's a way of the body not to defend against infection. Next is you may tell the parents or the caregiver that in case there's fever, so you may give actually paracetamol or ibuprofen, provided that the temperature of the child has reached its threshold of at least 39 degrees Celsius and above, or the patient is in distress or is in pain. And please also tell the parents to give the correct dose and the frequency. Next is to ensure that the strength of the medication corresponds to what is prescribed. Because as what I've mentioned a while ago, like for example, paracetamol, it can be given at a minimum of 4 to 6 hours. So sometimes, parents, if the temperature of the patient will not go down, even if it has not reached 4 hours yet from the last intake of the antipyretic, they would sometimes attempt to give ahead of what is the recommended minimum interval of time. So next is to use a thermometer to measure fever. So it is common there, in our setting, that instead of using, they will reason out that they do not have a thermometer at home, and they will just use the hand here, no touching, I don't have fever. So you really have to tell the caregiver that, ma'am, it is really actually nice that you really take the temperature, pila naman na ang thermometer. So it's better. Sometimes they actually have a thermometer, but they're just really too lazy to get it. So you really have to tell them, because actually the pattern of fever, the range also of the fever will actually help you with your differential diagnosis, rather than just saying, look, init, the patient was warm. Yeah, murag mawala, it will go away by itself. So we're just estimation. So it's really better, it's really documented in numbers through your thermometer. Next is if there is high fever, so of course, please, we have to tell the caregivers to keep the patient in light clothing, if it's and maintain the patient on a still warm but in a well-ventilated room. Next is to make sure that the child drinks, so that as to avoid dehydration. Then also, if ever the fever would persist no more than 2 to 3 days, we ask the caregiver to bring the patient back to the clinic or to the OPD. Next is also to advise the parents regarding danger signs, so what to watch out for, the red flags. No, so example, if the child is unable to breastfeed or unable to drink, there is small dark red spots on the skin. Basically, there is a rash. No, that does not disappear when the skin is being blanched or stretched. There is presence of stiff neck, convulsions, or the patient is unusually drowsy, or there is loss of consciousness, or there is fast or difficulty in breathing. And then we can also advise the caregivers that if ever the fever will occur again next time, okay, it is not inevitable that once in a while you really get sick. So if there are no worrisome signs, you can tell the caregiver can actually follow what we've discussed earlier, and there's no need to seek urgent medical assistance. Unless it really reaches, the fever really lasts 2 to 3 days, or the child, even if it has not reached 2 to 3 days yet, but the child has worrisome symptoms or any of the danger signs, then they have to consult a healthcare provider. Or if the child is less than 3 months old and has fever, they do not have to wait for 2 to 3 days. They really have to bring the patient to that healthcare provider the same day. So let's start with fever of less than 7 days. So let's go over the differential diagnosis that we can consider if we are presented with fever, fever of less than 7 days in particular. So the primary concern is to differentiate treatable infections with possible serious consequences from mild, self-resolving febrile illness. So first, again, we have to do a thorough history and PE since 80% of our diagnosis comes from it. Next is to help us rule in and rule out our differential diagnosis, then further work up with laboratories may be of help. But you have to take note that if for children more than 3 months of age and they really have a clear cause of the fever, like for example, there's really rhinorrhea, there's really loose watery stools, and there are no danger signs, so lab workup may not be necessary. So you may go clinical with your diagnosis. But again, for young infants with ages less than 3 months of age who are presented with fever, then most likely further lab workup may be necessary. Lab workup that can be done would include a pulse oximetry, if ever there are signs of difficulty in breathing. So a urine dipstick, you can do this in young children with high fever, or they have fever lasting more than 24 to 48 hours, with or without localizing signs of UTI. You can also do a blood analysis, like doing a CBC, a complete blood count, or getting your inflammatory markers such as your C-reactive protein, your procalcitonin, your ESR. For your CRP, that's your C-reactive protein, and your procalcitonin, it will help you discriminate whether the fever is caused by a bacteria or a viral infection. So it will help you guide you somehow if whether you need to start antibiotic in your patient. Other diagnostics that would actually depend on the presenting signs and symptoms of your patient. So if you're presented with urinary signs and symptoms, you can do a urine microscopy or culture. You can do a blood culture. You can do a lumbar puncture if it's more of neurologic infection. And to do a CSF analysis. So this is a table I lifted from Nelson. So here they delineated on how to evaluate a patient with acute fever. So basically, it's the same as the pocketbook. Now again, first do a thorough history, with the onset of the symptom, any associated signs and symptoms, any exposure, such as in the daycare, school, family, pets, playmates, or other ill individuals at home, any recent travel, any medications taken, any underlying comorbidities or disorders, and the immunization history of the patient. Next is to do a physical exam, again a complete, with focus on localizing signs and symptoms. And next is to do laboratories on a case-to-case basis based on the presentation of the patient. So for the differential diagnosis, so if it's fever without a localizing sign, so you may consider UTI. So usually it is a common cause of fever in younger children. So usually the patient will present with urinary frequency or dysuria, bedwetting when actually the child has already been dry at night. There is also it is also associated with your abdominal pain, loin, and suprapubic tenderness. It may also present with vomiting, poor feeding, lethargy, and irritability. Next is it may be a fever caused by any reaction to medications or recent immunization or vaccination. So you have to ask for the history of the recent vaccination or medication intake, any presence of muscle pain, most especially on the post-injection site. If usually they may present with sustained fever with no other signs and symptoms. And usually this fever will resolve in 72 hours after the medication, if it is caused by a medication, if that medication is stopped. You can also consider a sepsis. You can also consider typhoid fever. So usually there will be a history of travel, and it will present with persistent fever, constipation, vomiting, abdominal pain, tenderness, transient rash, enlarged liver or spleen. And in adolescents, it would commonly present as confusion. For differential diagnosis with fever with localizing sign, so one of the most common colds. No? So it will present with cough, no? It's usually dry cough, with coryza or runny nose. Generally, the patient will appear well, except for the runny nose, and there is no difficulty in breathing. Next is rhinosinusitis, so usually presenting with cough and headache. There's a foul smelling nasal discharge. So it may be associated with facial pain, swelling, or sore throat. For pneumonia, it will present commonly as cough, fever, fast breathing, and lower chest wall inching, grunting, and nasal flaring. For influenza, it commonly presents with cough. It's usually dry and can be severe that it could last to more than 2 weeks during the influenza season. It can be associated with your headache, muscle and joint pain. It can have body malaise, sore throat, and runny nose. COVID-19 could also present, usually with a history of exposure to another person diagnosed with COVID-19. And there could be cough, fast breathing, lower chest wall inching, could be loss of smell or anosmia, loss of taste or adhesion. Next is fever with a facial swelling. So one of the most common is mumps. So it will commonly present as muscle pain, headache, and body malaise. It can be followed by swelling of the parotid glands. So next is fever and an ear pain. So our most common in the pediatric population would be AOM, your acute otitis media. So usually on an otoscopic exam, there would be a bulging eardrum with middle ear effusion. And usually it can present as actually just fever and irritability. Next, it's your mastoiditis. This can be a complication of your AOM. So there is tender swelling and redness behind the ear, leading to protrusion of the pinna. For fever and painful mouth or throat, there can be tonsillitis. So sore throat, present with sore throat, pain on swallowing, enlarged cervical lymph nodes, and there could be petechiae, vesicles, and membranes on the tonsils. For infectious mononucleosis, this is common in the adolescent population. So they will present with tonsillar pharyngitis, actually quite similar to tonsillitis. However, they will present with body malaise, severe fatigue, and cervical adenopathy. And there could be respiratory symptoms. What's remarkable is in the infectious mononucleosis caused by your EBV, your Epstein-Barr virus, there is an enlarged spleen and your liver. That's what it differentiates with your tonsillitis. Also, the age group. For tonsillitis, this is common among 5 to 15 years old. Your infectious mononucleosis, that's common again among adolescents. Next is your herpetic gingivostomatitis. So there would be a painful mouth ulcer resembling to aphthous ulcer, affecting the tongue, gums, and hard palate. There is enlarged cervical and submandibular lymph nodes, and there is foul-smelling breath. Next is retropharyngeal abscess. This is a life-threatening condition. For fever with diarrhea and abdominal pain, the most common in the pediatric population is acute gastroenteritis. They may present with diarrhea associated with vomiting, abdominal cramps, and abdominal pain. Appendicitis, so that there's persistent pain and tenderness on the right lower quadrant associated with nausea, low appetite, and vomiting. And it can also be hepatitis. No? Abdominal pain, tender right upper quadrant, a large lesion, and there is jaundice with a dark urine. So next, for fever and joint or skin pain or swelling. So one of the most common would be septic arthritis. So the joints would present as warm, tender, and swollen. There would be pain on movement and at rest. There is refusal to move the affected limb or joint or to bear weight on the leg. So there is also reduced range of motion. For osteomyelitis, actually this presents quite similar to your septic arthritis. So usually it's subacute in onset. There's local tenderness and swelling over the affected bone. There's localized pain and pain upon movement of the affected extremity. And there will be a refusal to move the affected limb and to bear weight on the affected area. Next is for skin and soft tissue infection. So usually they would be swollen and red, painful and warm to touch, like your cellulitis. It could present with boils, no? And then swelling, pustules, pyomyositis, or your purulent infection of your muscles. Next is acute rheumatic fever. So it could present with migratory joint pain, heart murmur, carditis. No, subacute nodules, erythema marginatum, and your Sydenham's chorea. For your life-threatening conditions presenting with fever, so you have your meningitis, which commonly presents with neck stiffness, bulging fontanelles among infants, reduced level of consciousness, headache, and seizure. For encephalitis, there is altered mental status, focal neurologic signs, focal seizure, reduced level of consciousness, and headache. And for sepsis, it's a life-threatening condition, the patient would often look ill, they are lethargic, they are pale, they have reduced interaction with no apparent cause. They may present actually with signs of shock such as your prolonged capillary refill time, hypothermia in young infants. Actually, hypothermia for younger infants, fever for older age group. They may also have purpura or petechiae if it's a case of meningococcidia, and they may also present with fast breathing. So most of these differential diagnoses actually will be discussed under the different respective systems. This is so just an overview. So next would be severe pneumonia. So again, that's fever, cough, and this time there would be tachypnea, grunting, severe chest indrawing, fast breathing, cyanosis, and an O2 saturation of less than 90%. Next is myocarditis. So patient will commonly present with tachycardia out of proportion to the degree of fever. And then chest pain, respiratory distress, any signs of cardiogenic shock, arrhythmias, heart failure, such as eudyspnea and enlarged liver. Then they will also present with pericarditis. They will experience retrosternal pain, pericardial friction rub, and tachycardia and distal heart sounds. Then retropharyngeal abscess, so they present with sore throat, difficulty in swallowing, drooling saliva, muffled voice, and unable to speak. They will have tender cervical lymph nodes, airway obstruction, such as signs of airway obstruction such as stridor, and your fast breathing. Next would be your peritonitis. So this may present with acute abdominal pain. The abdomen would be rigid and it does not move with respiration. There is tenderness of abdominal palpation, and then there is decrease in bowel sounds. And then for severe dehydration, usually from your acute gastroenteritis, heat stroke, from prolonged exposure to intense heat, so patients may present with delirium, seizures, hallucinations, ataxia, dysarthria, coma, tachycardia, tachypnea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Then MIS-C, this is commonly associated with as a complication of your COVID-19 infection. So for the purpose of discussion this morning, so I will be discussing briefly on influenza, dengue fever, and mumps. So again, the goal of this lecture is more of a guide of the important details or the highlights to remember. As for the rest, like their pathophysiology, that's actually already your reading assignment. So let's start off with influenza. So your influenza is an acute respiratory infection caused by your influenza virus. The typical incubation period is 1 to 4 days on an average of 2 days. So the main mode of transmission is via respiratory droplets, but can be also acquired through contact with secretion and small particle aerosols. So a patient infected with influenza is potentially infectious from the day prior to the onset of the symptoms up to 5 to 7 days after the onset of symptoms. It is of note that in children with primary influenza, they have higher influenza viral load, so they have more prolonged viral shedding as compared to adults. So therefore, these children may be able to infect others longer compared to adults. So during influenza outbreak, which commonly occurs in schools, children, example, during opening of classes like right now, there is an increase in there is a surge of your influenza cases. So usually rainy season is the season for pediatrics. For the clinical manifestation, there is an abrupt onset, predominantly of systemic symptoms such as your fever, this is the most common, associated with myalgia, chills, headache, body malaise, and anorexia. Coryza, pharyngitis, and dry cough is usually present at the onset of illness, but it may be less prominent. In children, they may also present with abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. The typical duration of the febrile illness is 2 to 4 days, but cough may persist for longer periods. So because of its high transmissibility, other family members or close contacts of an infected person often experience a similar illness. So that is why in the history, it is a clue that other family members are also experiencing the same symptoms. The diagnosis of influenza depends on epidemiologic, clinical, and laboratory considerations. So during an epidemic, the clinical diagnosis of influenza in a child who has fever, body malaise, and respiratory symptoms may be based on the clinical discretion. But sometimes, if the clinical presentation, it is often indistinguishable from other respiratory virus, like your SARS-CoV-2, no, causing your COVID-19, your RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus, your para-influenza virus, your human metapneumovirus, adenovirus, and even your rhinovirus. So sometimes, at times, a confirmation of your influenza virus by a diagnostic testing may actually be helpful in these circumstances when other viruses are also co-circulating. So we can do your rapid antigen test, RT-PCR, and your nasopharyngeal swab, swab, which was common during the pandemic and even up to now. But actually, in reality, especially your RT-PCR, your BioFire, it's actually expensive. So most of the time, the cases of influenza infection is really clinically diagnosed. So for treatment, it is mainly supportive with adequate fluid intake and rest. Again, influenza is caused by a virus, so antibiotic is actually not necessary. But if there is a bacterial superinfection, then we may start antibiotics. So like for example, there is recrudescence of fever or recurrence of fever, prolonged fever, or deterioration in the clinical status of the patient. Antiviral medications may be an adjunct. It may be initiated, it works best if it is initiated early, particularly in the first 2 days of illness onset. So it can reduce the duration of symptoms and the likelihood of complications. So one antiviral medication, and it is available in our setting, is your oseltamivir. So most cases are actually uncomplicated, and the patient will begin to improve spontaneously, even without medication, after the first 48 to 72 hours of onset of the symptoms. Common complication of your influenza is your acute otitis media and your pneumonia. So the best means of preventing influenza illness is through annual flu vaccination. Now, why does it have to be annual, yearly administered? This is because the influenza virus is capable of antigenic shifting or antigenic drifting. Thus, new strains emerge. And there is annual changes in the co-circulating strains, thus making it necessary to update flu vaccination for effective protection. So even if the person or you are already infected with a certain flu strain, influenza strain, because it is capable of changing its phase, antigenic drifting or shifting, so the next time you come encounter that influenza virus, your body, because it has a new phase, so your body won't be able to recognize that flu and then get infected again. So for your influenza, so what's available in our setting is the inactivated form. But it is also nice to know that there is live attenuated type available outside of the country, and it's administered intranasally. So for inactivated vaccine, which is available here in our setting, so it is a quadrivalent type of vaccine. Quadri meaning 4, contains 4 strains of influenza virus. So we can give it at a minimum of 6 months of age, because less than 6 months, your influenza vaccine is not effective. Since the immune response is still insufficient, and protection relies during that time with the maternal antibodies and ergotamine. So for pediatric dose, we must follow the manufacturer's recommendation for pediatric population. In the past, we used to divide the dose into half for pediatric population. But right now, the latest recommendation is to give the full dose, same as adults. So may it be an adult, may it be a pediatric population, it's the full dose that we give. So no longer need to divide. It holds true also for the different brands available locally. So annual vaccination usually begins in February. Usually in preparation for the rainy season, like the season from June to December, because that is usually your flu season. For the dosing, so if you are given of a child less than 9 years old, and it is the first time in their entire life to receive flu vaccine, then during the first year, they have to receive 2 doses at least 4 weeks apart. Then thereafter, that's 1 dose yearly. If it's a 9-year-old to 8 and above, an 18-year-old and above, and an adult, regardless if it's a first-timer to receive flu vaccine or not, it's just really 1 dose yearly. Next is dengue fever. So dengue fever is an acute febrile illness caused by an infection of your dengue virus of the genus Flavivirus. So here in the Philippines, it is an all-year-round disease. It's really an endemic. So it is brought about by a mosquito-borne viral illness. It is transmitted through the infected Aedes mosquito, particularly here in the Philippines. It's more of Aedes aegypti and a little of Aedes albopictus. So they are actually day-biting mosquito. So what happens is that it starts with a bite of an uninfected vector, meaning an uninfected mosquito, to an infected human. So the dengue virus is being acquired by your mosquito, so that virus will multiply inside the mosquito. And then that infected mosquito will then bite another susceptible human. So it does not spread directly from person to person, because this is a common question. Makatakot ni Doc, will this infect other children or other people? So it does not. It's through a bite of a mosquito. So the incubation period of your dengue is, in humans, is 1 to 7 days from the bite of the mosquito. So you have to take note that there are 4 types of dengue virus. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you contract one dengue virus, you are protected from that particular dengue virus, but you are still capable of having the 2nd, the 3rd, or the 4th. So in your entire lifetime, you can have 4 dengue episodes. And for each dengue episode, because puro like brothers and sisters, no? The body will have a memory of similarity. So for each dengue you acquire in your lifetime, it will be more severe. So we have patients nga, it's really twice or thrice so that they had dengue in their life. So for the clinical manifestation, the main pathophysiology of your dengue fever is increased in vascular permeability, which leads to capillary leakage. You have to remember that with all the paragraphs and sentences in Nelson's, this is the keyword that you have to remember for dengue fever. Increased vascular permeability leading to capillary leakage. So let's first discuss the clinical manifestation according to the phases of dengue. So when we say phases of dengue, there are 3. You have your febrile phase, here, your uremic phase. Next is your critical phase, no, the afebrile phase. Next is your recovery phase, no. First, let's go to febrile phase. So acute febrile phase usually lasts 2 to 7 days of fever, and it is associated with signs and symptoms such as your fever, headache, body malaise, myalgia, arthralgia, retroorbital pain. No, usually retroorbital pain is felt among adolescents who have fever, who have dengue fever, and then anorexia, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, flushed skin. For the rash, it's more of petechial rather than Hermann's rash. For laboratory testing during the febrile phase, if a CBC will be done, so it would be a decreasing in pattern of your WBC, meaning there would be leukopenia, and there would also be a decrease in trend of your platelet or thrombocytopenia. If a dengue serology, which is more commonly done to confirm dengue, so usually your NS1 during the early first few days of your illness will be positive. IgM, it will become positive during the middle days of the course of the illness. So the problem during this phase is dehydration, febrile seizure due to the high fever, and neurologic disturbances. Next is the critical phase. So this is otherwise known as the defervescent phase, or when the fever subsides. So it does not mean in dengue, it does not mean that the fever has already gone, the patient is okay. No, the first 48 hours that your patient is afebrile, has no fever, is actually the most critical of the course of illness, the entire illness. So in this phase, again, there is a defervescence. So the temperature of the patient will go down to 37.5 to 38 degrees Celsius and would remain below this level. So during this time, the patient could either improve or the patient could either deteriorate, will manifest with warning signs, and may progress to dengue severe or dengue shock because of the increase in capillary fragility and plasma leakage. Because it is during the first 24 to 48 hours that there is a significant increase in the capillary fragility and there is severe plasma leakage. So for the warning signs, so you have your abdominal pain or tenderness, persistent vomiting. So it is a persistent vomiting that's either within a 5 or more than 5 within a 5-hour period, or within 2-hour period there is 5 episodes of vomiting. So next would be clinical signs of fluid accumulation, mucosal bleeding, lethargy or restlessness, liver enlargement, and the laboratories would show an increase in trend of your hematocrit. So particularly, it can reach to more than 20% from your baseline, and there would be a progressive decrease in your platelet count. So one of my mnemonics to help me remember with my warnings, with the dengue warning signs, is your ABCDLLL plus persistent vomiting. Again, A, abdominal pain or abdominal tenderness, B, bleeding or mucosal bleeding, C, clinical signs of fluid accumulation, D is for your decrease in urine output because it's also a warning sign, LLL, lethargy or restlessness, liver enlargement, and laboratories, and plus persistent vomiting. So the problem that would be commonly encountered with the critical phase or the defervescent phase is the patient can go into shock because of severe plasma leakage. They may have severe hemorrhage, and they will have organ impairment. So during the recovery phase, so there is gradual reabsorption of extravasated fluid from the intravascular space to the extravascular space by way of lymphatics. And this will occur or take place in the next 48 to 72 hours. Meaning, if your patient had already lapsed 48 hours afebrile from the last fever episode, and your patient is okay, then probably, most likely, that patient will already be in the recovery phase. No, okay na, your patient will improve. But if the first 48 hours of your patient is afebrile and then is not stable, there would be, your patient will be going to shock. So in this phase, during the recovery phase, lapsing 48 hours of fever once again, so generally the well-being improves, the hemodynamic status stabilizes, and here, because the extravasated fluid will now go back, so there would be an increase of your diuresis. They will urinate those excess fluids that have leaked out. So some patients, they may present with a Hermann sign. This one, it's white islands in a sea of red. White islands in the sea of red. So usually, if you see this rash, Hermann's rash, this is different from petechiae, the petechiae that's more associated with the febrile phase. For Hermann's rash, this is more associated with your recovery phase. So if you see this rash, that is a sign, a very good sign that your patient is improving and is already in the recovery phase. So malipay ta, we would want to see Herrmann's rash in our dengue patients. It's a sign of recovery. So next is during this time, the hematocrit also stabilizes. No, there will be no further increase, or sometimes it becomes diluted. It will decrease because of the dilution from the reabsorbed fluid. And during this time, the WBC will begin to rise after the defervescent, but your platelet, it will not yet be normal. So it will increase later as compared to your WBC. So problem that's commonly encountered during the recovery phase is hypervolemia brought about by the reabsorption of your extravasated fluid. So the next classification of dengue is according to severity. So we classify it into three. So you have your dengue without warning signs, no? When dengue with warning signs, and dengue severe, and dengue shock. No. So first is dengue without warning signs. So again, that's fever of 2 to 7 days associated with any two of the following. So as I mentioned a while ago, headache, body malaise, myalgia, arthralgia, retroorbital pain, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, flushed skin, petechial rash, and a positive tourniquet test. If a laboratory will again be done, the WBC will show a progressive decrease in WBC or leukopenia and a progressive decrease in your platelet. And if a dengue serology would be done during the early days of the course of illness, and S1 may be positive for IgM, it will turn out positive into the mid-course of the illness. So for tourniquet test, this is the one of your procedural skills, I think one of the Wednesdays. No, so your tourniquet test is otherwise known as your Rumpelit test. Please take note of this. Many of the clerks do not know that other name of your tourniquet test is your Rumpelit test. So it is not a diagnostic. It is part of your PE finding that probably this patient is dengue. No, is dengue. So what are we going to use? You are going to use a blood pressure cuff, because commonly the clerks, when we ask them, they say that we use a tourniquet because from the name of tourniquet test. Bantaya, when you go to clerkship, I will handle pediatrics, I will hear you saying tourniquet, extension ng juta mo. Alright? So you use a blood pressure cuff appropriate for the size, appropriate size based on the age of the patient. So meaning if your child is an infant, you use an infant blood pressure cuff. If it's a child, you use the one for the child. For a neonate, you use for a neonate. Appropriate cuff for age. So you take first the blood pressure of your patient. So usually, example, there will be 100/70, your systolic and your diastolic blood pressure. So you first, you add the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. So as for this example, it's 100/70. And then the answer, you divide it by 2, and then this would be your maintaining pressure. So you will again, meaning you get a blood pressure cuff, you take the BP of the patient, so that would be the blood pressure of your patient. You solve it, this is your answer. You again inflate the BP cuff, this time to this range. 4, that's around 5 to 10 minutes. And then deflate. Wait for 2 minutes. No? And then, you draw an imaginary 1 by 1 square inch in the antecubital fossa. Then you count if there is at least 10 petechiae in a 1 by 1 square inch, then that would be probable for dengue. But you have to take note that there are also other conditions, not just dengue, that can present with positive tourniquet test. So there are patients, there are people who are just well and may have positive tourniquet test. So it's not really definitive of dengue, it's just making your dengue probable. Next is for dengue with warning signs. So basically, that is dengue without warning signs plus the warning signs. No, so with warning signs again, that's dengue plus the warning signs. So again, ABCD, LLL, abdominal pain or tenderness, bleeding, mucosal bleeding, clinical signs of fluid accumulation, decrease in urine output, lethargy, liver enlargement, laboratories with increase in trend of your hematocrit. No, particularly the one significant is more than 20% of increase from your baseline hematocrit. And your persistent vomiting. And next is dengue severe, no, the third classification. Basically, it's dengue plus warning signs plus signs of shock, severe bleeding, no, and organ impairment. So, leading to fluid accumulation or distress. So for the lab workup, so we commonly get your CBC. No? So in the CBC, what is important? There are three important parameters in the CBC. So when you become clerks, when they ask for CBC for a dengue patient, what is more important is the WBC, the hematocrit, and the platelet. So for this WBC, there will be again a decrease in trend of your WBC or leukopenia, and then will have the lymphocytic predominance. There is an increase in your hematocrit because of hemoconcentration, and there would be a decrease in your platelet count. For dengue diagnostic test, so actually the gold standard is still viral culture. However, it is not commonly done because it is expensive, impractical. By the time that the viral culture will have a result, your patient is already well or might have died. So it's impractical to do so. So what we commonly do in the clinical setting is get a serology instead with your NS1 antigen, IgM antibody, and IgG antibody. RT-PCR, less common. So let's go to the diagnosis. So when you are suspecting dengue, so you have to ask yourself, is this dengue? Number two, if it is dengue, where are we in the phases of dengue? Whether this patient is febrile, critical, or in the recovery phase? Or are there any presence of warning signs? Or is the patient in shock? Or what is the hydration status and the hemodynamic status of the patient? And does this patient require to be admitted in the hospital? So those are the questions, no, if you're suspecting for dengue. Let's go to the management. So for this morning, I'll be discussing on Group A and Group B. For dengue with warning signs and with warning signs. For the dengue severe and the dengue shock, it would be discussed together with the pediatric emergencies. So for Group A, these are the patients without warning signs. They could be sent home. So these are patients who can tolerate adequate volumes of oral fluids. These are the patients who can urinate in less than 6 hours. They have no warning signs and they have stable hematocrit. By the way, among the three CBC parameters, no, WBC, hematocrit, and platelet, what we monitor more is your hematocrit. What can kill is an increase in your hematocrit. In dengue, there will always be a decrease in platelet count. That's really expected for dengue fever. But what could kill is actually your increasing hematocrit. Because usually, parents will be worried, the platelet is decreasing, the platelet is decreasing. You have to tell them that in dengue, it's really normal, it's really expected that the platelet will decrease. What we need to watch out for is actually the increase in the hematocrit because of severe capillary fragility leading to plasma leakage, leading to clumping, no, of your blood, and then it will block microcirculation. When it blocks microcirculation, it will go to the minute blood vessels like your liver, your spleen. It will burst, leading to bleeding. So that is what we are worried for, the hematocrit. So for group A, so again, those that can be managed at home, you can send home. So we use your reduced oral rehydrating salt solution, and we should avoid sports drinks such as, no sponsor but Gatorade, no? Which is commonly, because ORS in general tastes like seawater. So even us adults, we don't like drinking ORS. So the options for patients, they would rather drink sports drink. But we have to apprise them that actually sports drink should not be given and ORS is better. So what or how much fluid to give? So if you have a child more than 3 kilograms, not to 10 kilograms, so you give 100 cc per kilogram per day. Total niya siya. This is total 24-hour period. And then, if it's more than 10 kilograms up to 20 kilograms, that's 75 cc per kilogram per day. If you have 20 to 30 kilogram child, so that's 50 to 60 cc per kilogram per day. If you have a 30 to 60 kilogram child, that's 40 to 50 cc per kilogram per day. So if you have noticed, the younger the age group, the more fluids actually that you have to give. That is because the younger the person is, the more increased the body surface area is. More water fluid content also. So this is the home care guide for patients with dengue. So these are the things that you have to discuss or advise the caregivers when you are considering dengue the patient. So what should be done? There should be adequate bed rest. So adequate fluid intake, milk, fruit juice, and isotonic ORS, your reduced ORS. Barley or rice can be given. Plain water alone, you have to tell them that it may cause electrolyte imbalance because you're replacing with water, you're not replacing with the electrolytes that are being lost. Then you can tell them that they may take paracetamol according to the weight of the patient. In this time for dengue patients, we avoid ibuprofen because ibuprofen may actually further decrease the platelet, and it may also cause abdominal pain because it is an NSAID. Next is to do tip-in sponging for tip-in sponge bathing for if ever the patient will have fever. And we have to look for the possible mosquito breeding sites in the place at home or in school, and eliminate them. So what should be avoided? Again, NSAIDs, we should avoid them. And then if they are already taking it, we have to advise them to stop. And then you have also to tell them that antibiotics are not necessary in this case, since the dengue fever is caused by a dengue virus. So your antibiotic will not address anything. So you have to tell them with what are the warning signs, what to watch out for, the danger signs, when are you going to bring back the patient. So if there are any signs of bleeding, such as petechiae or patches on the skin, bleeding, nose bleed or epistaxis, and bleeding also from the gums, and then vomiting of blood, black colored stools or melena, heavy menstruation, and vaginal bleeding. As this is especially for your adolescent female age group. That is why part of your history taking is that when you are faced with around a 9-year-old and above female patient, you really have to ask if there is onset of menarche. And if there's already menstruation, then you have to ask for the last menstrual period. Because for these patients, if they have dengue, there's a tendency that there will be an early onset of their next menstrual cycle, and then it will be a heavier bleed, or they will have an intermenstrual bleed, or if they are currently having their menses, it will go heavier than usual. It's also actually a form of bleeding in these patients with dengue. Next is frequent vomiting, severe abdominal pain, drowsiness, mental confusion or seizures, pale or cold, clammy hands and feet, and a difficulty in breathing. So any of these warning signs, at least one, They have to bring back the patient to the hospital. But mind you, these patients are actually asked to follow up on a daily basis with a repeat CBC on a daily basis as well. So for your group B, these are the patients who require an in-hospital management. So again, these are patients, dengue patients who have warning signs, who have coexisting conditions such as pregnancy, opposite ends of the spectrum, the very young and the very old, those who are obese, those who are diabetic, those who have renal failure, basically those who have comorbidities. So we can also admit that even if they do not have warning signs, but they are just living alone, no one can monitor them, or they are living far from the facility, maybe they are living there in the mountain, no? And then they do not have any reliable means of transport. So we'd rather, even if they do not have any warning sign because of the social circumstance, we would still, it's still a criteria for admission. So what IVF can be used? So for the latest recommendation, we can use your balanced isotonic electrolyte solution. So here in the Philippines, there's only one brand, that's your Steroid-Fundin. If it's not available, because in the far-flung setting, no, outside of the city, it may be hard to look for that, it's not available, so we can use your acetate ringers. If again, it's not available, then we can use your plain lactated ringer solution. If it's not available, then we can go for your plain NSS, your 0.9% saline solution, normal saline solution. So for your group B, if they do not have any warning signs, so you can compute for the maintenance fluid using your caloric expenditure method or your otherwise as your holiday SEGAR method. So this is the calculation that we expect everybody to memorize, because there are actually three. You have your holiday SEGAR, you have your Ludan method. Actually, the Ludan method is just derived from your holiday SEGAR, and you have your body surface area Crawford method. But among the three, we expect everyone, especially when you go to clerkship, to memorize by heart holiday SEGAR method in computing for your maintenance fluid. So how do you compute for your holiday SEGAR? So you should memorize this. So for the first 10 kilos, that's 100 cc per kilogram. So 10 kilos is 1,000. 10 times 10, 1,000 cc. That's in 24 hours. And then if the patient is 10 to 20 kilograms, so first 1,000, meaning that's the first 10 kilograms, then for every increase in kilogram from 10 kilogram, you multiply it by 50 cc per kilo, then you add it by 1,000. So take for example, you have a 15 kilogram child. So the excess of 10 is 5. So 5 times 50, then you add it on top of 1,000. Not the 15 times 50. It's only the 5, the excess of the 10 kilograms. It's a common mistake also when you are asked to compute for maintenance fluid. You multiply the entire 15 with 15 plus 1,000. No ha? Excess of 10, multiply that by 50, then add it with 1,000. For if you have a child more than 20 kilograms, so 20 is actually 1,500 already. So for each excess from 20 kilograms, you multiply it by 20, then add with 1,500. So example, if you have a 21 kilogram child, 1 times 20 plus 1,500. So 1,520. That's a total fluid requirement 24-hour period. Maintenance fluid alone. For those with warning signs, so we obtain a reference hematocrit before the start of fluid therapy. Then with the use again of those isotonic solutions which I have mentioned a while ago, we start with, it depends on the clinical picture of the patient, the hematocrit, the status of the patient. We may go to as high as 5 to 7 cc per kilogram per hour for the first 2 hours. And then, if there's improvement, we can gradually decrease it to 3 to 5 cc per kilogram per hour for the next 2 to 4 hours. Then, if there is further improvement, once again, we can go to as low as 2 to 3 cc per kilogram per hour or less, depending again with the clinical response of the patient. So usually, this is our maintaining. No, 2 to 3 cc per kilogram per hour. Then again, we must reassess the clinical status and of course, correlate it with the laboratory. So it cannot be that laboratory alone or clinical status of the patient alone. We must correlate both what we see of the patient, what we examine, as well as the lab result. And again, give the minimum IV fluid required to maintain good perfusion and to maintain a urine output of at least 0.5 cc per kilogram per hour. For Group C, it will be discussed during the pediatric emergencies. So discharge criteria among those dengue patients who are admitted. So all of the following, dili siya one ha, it should be all present. So the patient should no longer be febrile for 48 hours. Diba, I've mentioned that it is the first 48 hours of febrile that the patient is in critical phase. Meaning, if your patient has already lapsed the 48 hours and then your patient is okay, you can actually discharge your patient. So next is, there should be an improvement of the clinical status as well. So general well-being, there is an improvement in your appetite, your hemodynamic status is okay, and then there's adequate urine output, and there are no signs of respiratory distress. And there is an increase in your trend of your platelet, so it does not have to be that you will discharge the patient na normal ang platelet. As long as we see that the platelet, the trend of the platelet is already increasing, even if it's not yet reached, I think everyone knows that the normal platelet count is 150,000 to 450,000. So sometimes they may go to as low as 20,000, 30,000. No, so as long as we see that the platelet is already increasing in pattern, so we do not have to wait. It will be normal, or it will be 100,000 kapin. Basta as long, sometimes we see consultants from 20, they 40,000, they 80,000 discharge. As long as it's increasing in trend, it's okay to discharge your patient. Next is stable hematocrit even without the presence of IV fluids. You can discharge all must be present. So for the prevention of dengue, so we have a 5S strategy of your DOH. It used to be 4S, but now it's already 5S. So first is search and destroy. So engage the community to again locate and remove, eliminate all the mosquito breeding places. So common would be containers, tires, flower pots, and even have you noticed water dispenser? There's like a basin that will catch the water. If you do not discard that frequently, sometimes you may see already the moyo already swimming there's water. So that is one common breeding place that is often missed at home, especially if the water dispenser is not covered. So you should look at that. And then, mind you, your mosquito loves fresh water, limpyo nga water. So your canals, especially now that it's frequently raining, so usually rainy season is really dengue season. And then next is self-protection. So bug spray, wearing of long sleeve clothes, and using nets or screen for protection. Then next is to seek early consultation if with symptoms like a fever, headache, pain, rash, bleeding, and for early diagnosis. Then support fogging and spraying. So health experts may use sprays, especially when there is really an increase in cases. So there's actually some sort of contradicting about the fogging. Because what's the problem with fogging is that it usually just drives away the mosquito. It does not kill the mosquito. So the mosquito will just transfer. Now, I think you saw a recent news, I think that was in Region 6, Mansigurito, na there was fogging in that certain school. I don't know what happened, but the kids actually were brought to the hospital because in fogging you use a chemical, so we should be careful also in fogging. So fogging is just considered there's really an increase so much with the cases, but usually what is more effective is searching for the breeding places. Next is stay hydrated. No, so again, one of the key for dengue is really to drink your ORS, no, to avoid hemoconcentration. So let's go to the last topic for this morning. So we'll talk about mumps. So mumps is an acute self-limited infection primarily affecting children 5 to 9 years of age, and it is caused by your paramyxovirus. So at times it is epidemic every 4 years, and the incubation period is between 12 to 25 days, usually around 16 to 18 days. The mode of transmission is via direct contact or by airborne droplets, and this targets the salivary glands, CNS, pancreas, and the testes. So to a lesser extent, it may also affect the thyroid, ovaries, heart, kidneys, liver, and the synovial joint. So the patient is considered as infectious 2 days prior to the onset of swelling of the parotid gland, up to 9 days after the onset of swelling. For the clinical manifestation, there is a prodrome lasting 1 to 2 days consisting with fever, headache, vomiting, body malaise, and myalgia. So parotitis then follows. Initially, it may be unilateral. In approximately 70 per cases, it may become bilateral. So the parotid gland becomes tender and may be preceded or accompanied by ear pain on the bilateral side or the ipsilateral side. And the pain is aggravated with ingestion of your sour and acidic foods or liquids. So eventually, as the swelling progresses, the angle of the jaw becomes obscured and the earlobe will be lifted upward and outward. So the opening of the Stenson duct may be red and edematous, and the parotid swelling peaks at approximately 3 days and then gradually subsides after 7 days or 1 week. So the fever and the other systemic symptoms, they will resolve in the first 3 to 5 days. So at times, there will be also morbilliform rashes seen. So here, no, as the swelling progresses, no, so there would be an obscure, like here, the child, no, di na siya tampo, double chin. So that is because of the swelling, no, of your parotid glands. So with the severe swelling or increase in the size, so the ear would be lifted upward and outward. Not quite common nowadays because of the vaccination, but sometimes every now and then, because there are cases na vaccine, there are kind of patients who are anti-vaxxers who don't get their children vaccinated. So sometimes you may encounter these. The first time I encountered these, usually you see them, there's a blue, so there's an aniel, it's a blue colored, no, they used to believe that it will, if it will resolve, no, the swelling, but it does not do anything. No, blue siya, aniel, muna sa olden times, aniel. So most of the time, the diagnosis of mumps is done clinically through the history of exposure to a person with mumps infection, appropriate incubation period of 16 to 18 days, and the presence of the typical clinical findings of mumps infection. For the lab workup, if it is deemed necessary, because usually, again, in most cases, we don't do laboratory workup and just diagnose it clinically, so you can do a serum amylase value. No, it will be increased. And for a CBC, so it will reveal a leukopenia with a relative lymphocytosis. Basically, it's a typical viral picture for CBC. So for treatment, it is supportive. So there is no specific antiviral available for your mumps. So we go for supportive, so giving pain relievers such as your antipyretics for pain to reduce to also the fever, and to encourage also hydration, to prevent dehydration. So since the patient is infectious, of course, we advise the patient to be isolated up to 1 week. So for complications, the most common would be your meningitis with or without encephalitis. And for adolescent male, what's common is your gonadal involvement or your orchitis. So like it will present as testicular pain in adolescent who had mumps infection. So other complications that are actually uncommon, you may encounter conjunctivitis, optic neuritis, pneumonia, nephritis, pancreatitis, mastitis, and thrombocytopenia. For the prevention, ultimately it's still vaccination. So this time with your MMR. So your measles, mumps, rubella combination. So there is actually no monovalent mumps vaccine. So mumps vaccine, it is part of the measles, mumps, and rubella. It is a live attenuated vaccine. You give it via subcutaneous route, meaning through the fat, and it's 2 doses. So the first dose is given between 12 to 15 months of age ideally, and the second dose may be given at 4 to 6 years of age, but if there's a need to give it earlier, we may give it earlier with a minimum interval of 4 weeks from the first dose. Alright, so that's the end of the first day. See you tomorrow. Thank you.